So first, let me start by asking what actually happened in Charlottesville.
Thank you so much, Ernie, for that kind introduction, Shirley and Dahlia and the whole team for having me tonight, and Shabbat Shalom to everyone. Before we dive in, I'm going to share my screen briefly and show a short 2-minute video that I think will bring us back to Charlottesville 3.5 years ago and set the stage for our conversation. I do like to warn people that given the nature of what we're talking about, this isn't the most pleasant of videos. There are some disturbing images and sounds. And so I'm going to share my screen now to share that video, and then we will dive into the conversation.
Who's free? I'm free! Who's free? I'm free! Who's free? I'm free!
Terror in Charlottesville. Stark displays of racism.
Trying to promote violence. A car has rammed into a crowd.
Victims thrown in the air.
Deadly act of domestic terror.
One woman dead, others seriously wounded.
10 of the people who were injured in Charlottesville, including 3 of the people who were hit by that car and survived, have now brought a lawsuit against not only the murderer who drove his vehicle into the crowd, but also the leaders of all of the white nationalist groups that organized and promoted the Charlottesville event.
We are Integrity First for America. We are here to disrupt the extremism, to interrupt the cycle, to dismantle and bankrupt these hate groups and their leaders, to put them out of business, and most importantly, to stop the violence. Integrity First for America is leading the fight against white supremacy. Our Charlottesville lawsuit is the only current legal effort taking on the broad leadership of this movement, holding white supremacists accountable for their premeditated violence. We know that it's working. They're already facing huge financial and legal consequences. But we also know what we're up against. Bankrupting Nazis isn't cheap. These groups are still recruiting, weaponizing fear, and preparing for their next attack. Now more than ever, we are reminded of our obligation to dismantle the systems of white supremacy that poison this country. Turn your outrage into action, because hate has no place here.
Well, again, thank you all again for taking the time to dive into such a difficult, but I think important topic, and to sort of answer the question Shirley posed to start the conversation. It's so easy to forget, particularly in the news cycle in the world that we live in these days, that 3.5 years ago in an American city, neo-Nazis, white supremacists descended on that city and violently attacked that community, targeting people based on their race, their religion, and their willingness to defend the rights of others. First, on Friday, August 11th, I think we all remember viscerally what we felt when we saw those images and heard those sounds of neo-Nazis with tiki torches, which they chose specifically to evoke the KKK and the Nazis, chanting things like "Jews will not replace us" and "blood and soil." They ultimately surrounded a small group of peaceful counter-protesters at the Thomas Jefferson statue on the UVA campus, the University of Virginia campus. They kicked them, punched them, beat them up, threw fuel and lit torches at them. One of our plaintiffs, an African-American undergrad, said he thought he was going to die that night. And nearby, an interfaith gathering was taking place. It had been brought together by a number of clergy leaders and community leaders from around Charlottesville to create a safe space for the community to come together, knowing that white supremacists were coming to town, and the irony of them having to shelter in place because it became so unsafe outside their doors is not lost on me, and I think many of you, I'm sure. The next day, Saturday, August 12th, I think we all know how the day culminated with the car attack that ultimately killed Heather Heyer and injured many, including many of our plaintiffs. But it was truly a day and a full weekend of violence. We know first, these white supremacists and neo-Nazis marched this time on downtown Charlottesville. It was a Saturday morning, so the local synagogue was celebrating Shabbat. And in their online chats that morning, they talked about how they wanted to, quote, torch those Jewish monsters. And they stood outside the synagogue chanting things like Sieg Heil, carrying semi-automatic weapons. The synagogue had to ultimately evacuate congregants and Torah scrolls out the back. The synagogue was home to a Holocaust scroll that had been saved from Nazi Germany decades ago. And the detail that always gets me is that somehow in 2017, the scroll that had survived Nazi Germany was somehow once again under Nazi threat right here in America. And I think that really embodies so much of what was at stake and the horror of that weekend. The violence continued. They violently charged a line of interfaith clergy who had been peacefully protesting, including our plaintiff, Reverend Seth Wispelway. And the day culminated with the car attack in which James Fields drove his car into a crowd of peaceful counter-protesters, killing Heather Heyer, injuring many of our plaintiffs and others, including Marcus Martin and Marissa Blair, who you saw in that video. Marcus is the African-American man sort of splayed across the back of the car in that iconic Pulitzer-winning photo of the attack, and many others, including Natalie Romero, Thomas Baker, who's seen flipping over the hood, and a number of other Charlottesville community members. And so what's so important to understand here is that nothing that happened in Charlottesville that weekend was an accident, but rather it was planned for months in advance on social media, including on a site called Discord that I think actually you all might be familiar with because it's a mainstream site that many of us use to communicate with our friends and our colleagues. It's very popular among video gamers to communicate as they're playing games. And it was exploited and abused by the Charlottesville neo-Nazis and white supremacists to meticulously plan this violence in advance, from the banal and mundane discussions of what to wear, what do we bring for lunch, is gluten-free bread best? Will mayonnaise spoil in the sun? When Hannah Arendt talked about the banality of evil, it was truly encapsulated in these conversations. But of course, they also talked about the vile and the violent, how to use quote unquote free speech instruments like flagpoles as weapons, and even whether they could hit protesters with cars and then claim self-defense, which is of course exactly what they did. And so nothing was an accident. And on behalf of a coalition of Charlottesville community members who were injured, we are supporting this federal lawsuit against the 24 individuals and hate groups directly responsible for conspiring to bring this violence to Charlottesville.
What's the legal theory of this case?
So there's always a lot of talk about how do we balance the fight against extremism with our First Amendment free speech rights. In this case, I think it's so important to say from the outside, is not a speech case. It's a conspiracy case. And using a number of civil rights statutes, including something called the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, which was passed exactly 150 years ago by the Reconstructionist Congress. It was originally passed to protect recently freed slaves from Klan vigilante violence in the South, where these Klansmen would use the threat of violence and often violence itself to try to undermine the Black population's recently won 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment rights. And it's been used a number of times since to go after these sorts of racist, violent conspiracies. So much of our civil rights laws in this country specifically deal with the question of how does the government have a responsibility to protect our rights? This is a statute that uniquely in a number of ways gives private citizens a right of recourse against other private citizens to hold them accountable for efforts to undermine their civil rights. And it's been used, like I said, both in the late 1800s, early 1900s against the Klan. It was used during the Freedom Rider era, and we are using it here to take on the racist, violent conspiracy that we saw unfold in Charlottesville, that those social media chats and so much other evidence in the case detail so meticulously.
How does this case fit into the broader fight against far-right extremism? How has this case already had a significant impact on some of the leaders of the white supremacy movement and their organizations?
Yeah. So I think certainly January 6th, the attack at the Capitol put a very fine point on the crisis that we're grappling with here. I don't think anyone could have watched what happened and been surprised by it. I would say that if you were surprised by what happened at the Capitol, you perhaps haven't been paying attention to the cycle of violence over the last 4 years, and particularly for the Jewish community, it's a cycle of extremist violence we haven't been able to ignore because it's so directly targeted us and synagogues around this country, in addition to so many other communities whose fates are inextricably linked to our own. And so We know both anecdotally and statistically that we're really grappling with a crisis of white supremacist and white nationalist violence. We know, for example, that according to the FBI, 2019 was the deadliest year on record for hate crimes. According to the Department of Homeland Security, white supremacy is, quote, the most persistent and lethal threat to this country. We know that report after report from a variety of NGOs finds that those responsible for domestic extremist attacks are by and large far-right extremists, whether it be the ADL, which put out their latest murder and extremism report just this week, affirming that, or a variety of other entities, including the think tank CSIS, which put out a study that shows how nearly all domestic extremist attacks are perpetrated by the far right. And this is so important because there are many who will try to point fingers at both sides here and say, well, there's anti-Semitism, there's extremism on both sides. And that's true. That exists. But the people who are walking into our synagogues and killing people, the people who are plowing their cars into peaceful counter-protesters on our streets, the vast majority of violent extremism in this country is motivated by a far-right extremism, a white supremacy, a white nationalism that is truly cutting to the core of not just our own security and our safety, but our very democracy. And so this case is so important because it uniquely takes on the groups and the leaders that are at the center of that violent movement. Everything that has happened over the last few years are no accidents. We know that they're part of this cycle of white supremacist violence in which each attack is used to inspire the next one. So, for example, the Pittsburgh shooter who killed 11 Jews praying in synagogue on Shabbat 2.5 years ago communicated with some of the Charlottesville leaders before his attack. The Christchurch shooter who killed dozens of Muslims praying in mosque 2 years ago first donated to some of the Charlottesville leaders, two of our defendants, Richard Spencer and Andrew Anglin, and then painted onto his gun a white power symbol that was first popularized by another one of our defendants. And Christchurch was live streamed on Facebook and in turn inspired the Poway Chabad attack, the El Paso Walmart attack. So on and on, you see how this cycle goes in which each attack is used by these violent extremists to inspire the next one, to recruit and to encourage violence and terror. And so how do we break that cycle? We break that cycle by actually having accountability and real accountability, which has been so sorely lacking over the last few years. By going after the leaders and the groups at the center of this movement through our suit, we can have major financial, operational, and legal impacts on their ability to spread their hate, to spread their violence. We're already seeing those impacts even before we go to trial. We're slated for trial this October 25th in Charlottesville in federal court. But even before trial, our team has been tireless in filing motions for sanctions and making sure that the defendants are held accountable to their obligations in this lawsuit. And if they aren't, they face the consequences. And that has included huge monetary penalties, tens of thousands of dollars in monetary penalties against a number of defendants, even jail time for 2 of them who have been found in contempt of court, evidentiary sanctions for any attorneys who are watching. You might know how rare and how hard it is to win evidentiary sanctions in a case. And what this means is that the jury will be instructed at trial to treat as an established fact that one of our defendants indeed committed a racist conspiracy in Charlottesville 3.5 years ago, which is the core allegation of our suit. So this means we've effectively won our case against him even before trial. And Richard Spencer, one of our defendants, a neo-Nazi whose name I'm sure many of you know, complained just a few months ago in court that our case has been, quote, financially crippling. And so we see by going after these individuals and groups financially and operationally, we can have major impacts on how they operate, on how they can spread their violence and their hate. And it's not an accident that so few of them were did not play prominent roles at the Capitol, because they have been crippled and marginalized as a result of this lawsuit. And we also hope as a result that this case doesn't just seek accountability and justice for them, but also provides a model for the broader accountability that has been so sorely lacking on this front over the last few years.
Who are the plaintiffs, and other than Richard Spencer, who are the other defendants?
The plaintiffs are truly the bravest people I know. They're a coalition of Charlottesville community members who were injured in the violence. Some are University of Virginia students and law students, an African-American undergrad who goes by John Doe in this case because the threats against him have been so vile and violent. Some UVA law students like Liz Sines, who was a incoming 2L when the violence happened, and she was surrounded at the Thomas Jefferson statue and also was there during the car attack. And then a number of others, including Marcus Martin and Marissa Blair, the couple who you saw again splayed across the back of the car during the attack, Thomas Baker, Natalie Romero, Chelsea Alvarado, and others who were injured in that violence, and Reverend Seth Wispelway, who was a community and faith leader in Charlottesville, who organized that interfaith gathering and was violently attacked when he was marching with his fellow clergy members to stand up against white supremacy. And I just think they're so brave and so inspiring because they survived the unthinkable. And instead of being angry, and instead of sort of curling up in a ball and letting it overtake them, they've decided to channel what they survived into this case and into fighting for justice and accountability, not just for them, but for their community and for this country. And it's not been an easy process. It's, as you can tell, we are 3.5 years out from when the violence in Charlottesville happened. Justice has not been swift in this case. By the time we go to trial, it will be over 4 years since the violence. But the fact that they've chosen this path because it's so important to bring these extremists to justice, I think is so reflective of how brave they are and how inspired I am by them. The defendants are a number of individuals and groups whose names I think you will all know. We talked about Richard Spencer, also neo-Nazis, including Andrew Anglin, who runs the Daily Stormer, which is the world's largest neo-Nazi site. Matthew Heimbach, Chris Cantwell, who's known as the Crying Nazi, if you saw the Vice documentary on Charlottesville. A variety of others, including a man who goes by Eli Mosley, whose real name is Elliot Klein. Jeff Scoop, who runs the National Socialist Movement, which is the country's largest neo-Nazi group, and a number of other hate groups that include the League of the South, the sort of military wing of the Proud Boys, and a variety of other groups like Identity Europa, Vanguard America, and certain KKK groups. So it really is a who's who of this violent movement, both individuals and hate groups. And as I already mentioned earlier, some are already seeing very real consequences even before trial as a result of their continued inability to comply with court orders and our team's sort of tireless motion practice to ensure that they are held accountable. And when we go to trial this fall in Charlottesville and win large financial judgments from a jury of Charlottesville and Virginia community members, they will finally be held accountable and penalized with the large financial penalties that we think they deserve for the violent racist conspiracy they brought to Charlottesville 3.5 years ago.
Can you tell us more about what motivates the defendants? What motivates their hate and who are their targets?
Yeah. So, you know, when we hear things like Jews will not replace us, it's a term that I think many of us probably have heard at this point because it's been so central to these sorts of attacks, but I think it's important to understand what it actually refers to. And that conspiracy theory, this idea called the Great Replacement or replacement theory, is a very specific white supremacist conspiracy that believes that the Jewish people are puppet masters in an effort to replace the white race. To commit white genocide, if you will, as they describe it. And they see anything, whether it be the civil rights movement in the 60s, or the fact that we had our first Black president 12 years ago, 13 years ago, and any of the other ways in which people of color, minorities, and populations that don't fit into their vile, narrow vision for what they want this country to be, in which those communities have any success, they believe must be the result of Jewish puppet masters pulling the strings, funding them, and making it so. And you see this manifest in a variety of ways. You see it manifest in the most violent ways in Charlottesville or in Pittsburgh, where the shooter specifically targeted that synagogue because they partnered with the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society to support immigrants and refugees. But you also see it manifest in more mainstream ways that we might not necessarily pick up on at first glance. When you hear right-wing politicians talking about George Soros funding a caravan coming up from Mexico and in Central America, or frankly, any of these conspiracies that involve talking about George Soros funding the Black Lives Matter protests, or voter fraud that they believe is stealing the election from their rightful sort of power that they believe they should have. And it's not an accident as well that this idea of stopping the steal that was so central to January 6th feeds into this narrative that the country is being stolen from white people, because that's what's at the core of this ideology. And this ideology, I think, really does speak to how inextricably linked our fates are as communities. As Jews, we know that the violation of the civil rights of any one community is bad for us. It has never been good for us throughout our history to have any community's rights violated. We know that, and we have watched centuries upon centuries of history in which that's been true. And it works in reverse. We know that when we see this vile anti-Semitism targeting us, it's also because they know we are supporting the refugee and immigrant population, or the Black community, or the Latinx community. And when we hear them talking about Black Lives Matter protests being frauds because of Soros's support, it is meant to undermine the very real desire to make clear that Black Lives Matter, and the very real success of those protests in starting to shift the public conversation. And so it's so important to understand that this ideology that motivates them is rooted in this idea of tearing communities apart at a time when all of our fates are so deeply intertwined in the fight against this extremism.
What kind of threats are the plaintiffs and the legal team in IFA facing?
So unsurprisingly, the defendants aren't very thrilled that they are being held accountable in this lawsuit. Probably not shocking. And this is an effort that has also been led by Jewish women, myself, and our two lead counsels. We're 3 Jewish women, and they have made it well known in their harassment and their threats that they don't like that. Just earlier this week, for example, there was a long post on Stormfront, which is one of the prominent neo-Nazi websites, that called us, let me get this right, I think, hyper-litigious Jewish co-ethnics, with photos of us and all this other stuff. And this is the point in the conversation where I always like to make sure my mother's not on the Zoom, because this is her least favorite part of the work that I do. The threats are real. This is what they do to try to avoid accountability. They use violence and harassment to try to scare us and our plaintiffs and anyone involved with this case away from holding them accountable. And we're not going to let them do that. At IFA, at Integrity First for America, to be completely frank, the biggest line item in our budget is security. The legal work is pro bono. There are certainly other expenses in this case that we have to make sure are covered, like evidence collection and recovery. But the biggest line item is security, because of the threats that we get, our lawyers get, our plaintiffs get, and our expert witnesses are getting and will get when we go to trial this fall. And so we take necessary steps to keep everyone safe, from seeing what they're saying about us on the dark web on any given evening, to, of course, having physical security when we actually go to trial in Charlottesville this fall, and any other in-person hearings that require it. But we're not going to let them use these threats and this harassment and this violence to dissuade us, to scare us away from holding them accountable.
On January 6th, we saw a violent insurrection in the halls of the U.S. Capitol that in many ways used a playbook from Charlottesville. Can you tell us about the through lines from Charlottesville to the Capitol and what we can expect to see going forward?
Yeah, I think many of us watched the violence on January 6th. And as I said earlier, we were perhaps shocked and horrified, but I don't think many of us were surprised by what happened. It was the natural culmination of years of disinformation and hate and violence that has been allowed to not only go unfettered and unchecked, but also had fuel being thrown on it from the very highest levels of our own government, from members of Congress to the White House. And so again, none of us should have been surprised by what we saw. And we know that the playbook that they followed at the Capitol in so many ways reflected the playbook that we saw in Charlottesville 3.5 years ago. They planned this violence online, and with every day, it seems like there's another charging document that comes out from the Department of Justice illustrating just how well planned this all was in advance by these insurrectionists, using social media, using the same sorts of tools that the Charlottesville leaders used in planning that violence. We saw them show up at the Capitol with weapons and tactical gear, just like the neo-Nazis in Charlottesville did. And there was even discussion in both cases of using those quote unquote free speech instruments like flagpoles as weapons. And I think many of us have seen the reports of how, for example, a Capitol police officer was beaten with a flagpole at the Capitol on January 6th. And of course, we also know that they are fueled at their core by a vile, violent white supremacy. And while it manifests in maybe slightly different ways, where they were chanting, "Jews will not replace us" in Charlottesville and "Stop the steal" here at the Capitol, as I described, it all is fundamentally about this idea of the country being stolen from white people by communities of color, by Jewish people, and by any of these other people who don't fit into that narrow vision for a white ethno-state that so many of these extremists crave. And so it's important to recognize that when we see things like this Camp Auschwitz shirt that went viral, or the noose that was hanging outside the Capitol, or the Confederate flags that were so prominent, those are they're telling us exactly who they are, and we should believe them. And of course, the parallels can go on. I think in both cases, the instinct among the right has been to try to deflect blame by pointing fingers at Antifa, while there is zero evidence that Antifa had any involvement. And all evidence points to the fact that this was a meticulously planned far-right attack on the Capitol, much like Charlottesville was a meticulously planned far-right attack on that community. And so it's important to understand these parallels. It's also important to understand that the movement has really evolved in ways over the last 3 years, including the fact that some of these extremists that we saw at the Capitol were not the same sorts of organizational white supremacists that we saw in Charlottesville, but rather someone who could very well be our next door neighbor. And so few of the people who were at the Capitol were necessarily directly affiliated with hate groups or other organizations. And that, much like so much else that's happened in recent months, speaks to sort of the mainstreaming of extremism in this country, which is really important for us to understand. All of this is to say, though, we know that there is a path forward that works, that can have a major impact on these extremists and their ability to operate, their willingness to be a part of this sort of violence, and the ability to deter others from participating in it. And that is accountability. That's holding them accountable and bringing them to justice, like our suit has done. And as I mentioned earlier, it's important to know that while some of our defendants did play a role in cheerleading the violence at the Capitol, mainly Andrew Anglin on his site, The Daily Stormer, many of them were nowhere to be seen. And that is because this lawsuit has crippled them and pushed them to the sidelines of this movement. And so if we as a small nonprofit can do that through a litigation like this, imagine what the Department of Justice could do using the tools it already has civilly and criminally to hold these extremists accountable. And so we hope that our suit isn't just about the accountability Charlottesville and our Charlottesville deserves, our plaintiffs deserve for our defendants, but also that it can serve as a model and as validation of this sort of strategy being taken and used on a broader scale at a moment when we so desperately need this sort of justice.
We have a new president who very clearly in his inaugural address promised to take on white supremacy and the far right. What can we expect from the Biden administration on this front? And what can they learn from IFA and the Charlottesville case?
So I started to allude to this a bit in my last answer, but I think even, how many weeks has it been? 2 weeks, 3 weeks since since inauguration? Time feels like it has no meaning these days. I'm sure we all feel the same way. But it's been and not a not long amount of time since the inauguration, and we're already seeing some initial steps, which gives me hope. And it's strange to feel hope these days, but I'm optimistic despite the topic at hand. On the second full day of the Biden administration, Press Secretary Jen Psaki announced some initial steps that the administration is taking to both assess this threat through a coordinated effort among the various intelligence agencies and other government agencies, and then begin to take initial steps to counter it using the tools that the federal government has. We've also, of course, seen some initial prosecutions from the Department of Justice, some individual cases, a handful of sort of smaller conspiracy cases. And just this week, there were reports that DOJ is considering a RICO case, which is, for those who don't know what that is, sort of the racketeering and conspiracy cases that used to be brought against, for example, the mafia and gang members. It's a sort of broader based conspiracy case that we're talking about here. If there had been a Department of Justice circa 2017 that was interested in taking on far right extremism, it's perhaps the type of case they would have brought against what we saw in Charlottesville, the parallel to the civil case that we are doing. And so, as I mentioned earlier, I really think our case can provide a model that if we, on the civil front as a small nonprofit, can do this, if DOJ, using its criminal tools in addition to the civil tools it has, can make such a major financial, operational, and legal impact on these extremists using the tools it has right now. Of course, there's also already debates about what other tools our federal government might need. And I would just say that there's such an inclination to go from sort of 0 to 60 right now in throwing new tools at this. And there will certainly be new tools and resources we might need in this fight. But it's important to understand that the last administration not only didn't do anything on this topic, but actively disinvested from fighting extremism while throwing fuel on the fire. And so simply by re-engaging on that front, using the tools that we have, there's so much that the Biden administration can and seems to already be doing in its first few weeks. There will be debates and discussions around things like a domestic terror statute. And I'd say that it's important to recognize some of these debates are going to be convoluted and hard, and there are very real concerns around the idea of a domestic terror statute and how it can be abused to, for example, violate a number of people's civil liberties and go after groups like Black Lives Matter. And so I think we need to go into this eyes open, recognizing that there are so many tools we have right now to hit the ground running in this fight, not just on the federal government level, but on the state and local level, of course, on the private sector level, with social media companies being one of the most obvious and important players, and with NGOs like us who will continue to use the tools we have to fight for justice and accountability. So again, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's at a time when it's easy to feel helpless and hopeless. I am a little bit optimistic that based on what we've seen from the Biden administration over the last few weeks, and knowing that they have the tools to really hit the ground running here.
I'm sure you've heard this question before. How does your organization differ from the Southern Poverty Law Center?
It's a great question. And I will also fold in two other organizations that often come up in that question, just to preempt anything that might come up in Q&A. So we always asked about SPLC, the Anti-Defamation League, and the ACLU. Those are the three groups that I suspect many of you support in various ways and want to know how they fit in here. Starting with the SPLC, the Southern Poverty Law Center. They have been a wonderful partner of ours. We've done a number of events with them. We work closely with their intelligence project and with their Hate Watch site, which is really, I think, one of the best sites out there for tracking and monitoring these extremists. And they pioneered this sort of legal strategy decades ago in the 80s and 90s. And a lot of their cases really were some of the precedents for our case. And so while they are not bringing the sort of broader based legal cases that they used to, at least in this very moment, I suspect that there will be a lot coming out of them in the coming weeks, months, and years, because they have some new leadership there that is fantastic. But they have been a partner of ours here. Similarly, the Anti-Defamation League, while they themselves have never pursued legal cases like this, they of course do fantastic work in terms of tracking these extremists. Their Center on Extremism and the staff there are just incredible in terms of the research that they do. They have formally invested in our case, which I think is pretty rare, having one nonprofit invest in another, and we think is a testament to the importance of this litigation. And so we have that formal support from them and frequently work with their Center on Extremism, much like with the SPLC, on that research piece to make sure our work is informing one another. And then the ACLU, I think many of you might know that the ACLU, of course, helped secure the permit for Unite the Right, of course, not knowing the violence that was being planned in these social media chats by some of its leaders. Understandably, they didn't know that. They've, of course, since changed their policy, but they're conflicted out of our case as a result because of their role with the permit. That being said, we've been really heartened to have the support of a number of ACLU leaders, the former president, Nadine Strassen, Steve Rohde, and others who have been very clear in articles they've published and elsewhere that our case is the perfect mechanism for taking on extremism without violating the First Amendment, without crossing into that free speech territory. And that's an argument that was echoed in the judge's decision in our case, rejecting the defendant's motions to dismiss, making clear that the First Amendment does not protect violence. And while we expect our defendants to certainly reiterate this argument again and again at trial, it's already been rejected by the court in that decision rejecting the motions to dismiss. And if I would say if the ACLU says, or if ACLU leaders like Nadine Strassen and others say that this is a case that does not cross that line, I feel pretty good that we can all agree that this is a case that effectively walks that line, holding extremists to account without violating the question of the First Amendment.
So now, how can we help?
Well, there's so much that people can do on this front, both when it comes to this case in IFA and the broader fight against violent extremism. The fact that you are taking time out of your lives, particularly, I think right now at a time when the news cycle is such, when the world is such, it's easy to not want to engage on these topics. And so I really appreciate you all spending time on your Friday evening to learn about this and hear about this. On IFA specifically, I think, as I said, it's so easy to feel helpless and scared. And this is one of the few tangible, concrete ways to take action in the fight against extremism. I'm the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, and it's been impossible to look at what's happened in this country and in our world over the last few years without starting to draw parallels to some of the darkest times in our history. But I do think that there's one major difference, which is that we live in a country that's based on the rule of law and that has a justice system, and we can use them to fight back. And while we've had to fight like crazy to protect that rule of law and to protect that justice system, we still have them and we're using them in this case. And it so uniquely creates a concrete, tangible way to take action on an issue that is so easy to feel helpless on. And so if you're inspired to do so, you can get involved through IFA. You can go to our website, integrityfirstforamerica.org, and I can put some of this in the chat. And I think you all have it on your website, and we'll be sending it out after the fact as well. If you're so inspired to support the case, every single dollar we raise directly supports the case, and specifically those security costs that I mentioned, keeping our team safe as we go to trial, in addition to other costs like evidence collection and deposition transcripts and all the other fun parts of litigating a case like this. It's not going to fancy legal fees. This case is being done pro bono by 5 different law firms with the best team of lawyers I'm so fortunate to get to work with. And there's also a ton of material on our website that you can use to introduce your friends and your networks to this case. Videos of prior events. I think we'll also have a video of this event that might be available, news articles, an activist toolkit. And so please spread the word. Let people know that there is a way to actually do something now that is having a crippling impact on these extremists and a tangible impact in the fight. And so at the very least, do what you can to support this case. And we are so incredibly grateful for whatever you can do, whether it be a donation or spreading the word, or just simply following us on social media and signing up for case updates. However, this is a much broader issue. It doesn't stop and end with litigation. There is so much more that needs to happen. We need to be holding our elected officials to account, not just on the federal level, but also on the state and the local level. There is so much that can be done in terms of prosecuting hate crimes, in terms of making sure that communities are feeling safe at a time when these extremists are so emboldened. In terms of making sure that social media companies and the private sector are living up to their own responsibilities. No social media company is obligated to give a platform to hate. That's not what the First Amendment says. And so anyone who tries to claim that that sort of speech, that violence, that extremism is protected on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or YouTube, they're just sort of full of it, to be frank. And so holding the social media companies, holding tech companies to account to their obligations to remove hate and extremism from their sites is so important. And there are a number of ways to do that as consumers who use this site, including through campaigns like the Stop Hate for Profit campaign. And more broadly, just don't let this issue fall off the radar screen. It feels like there's an attack and we talk about it and then we move on. We're living in a news cycle that is hard and busy and crazy, and every day it seems like there is something else that is happening in this world that rightfully takes our attention. But we can't let this issue fall off the radar screen. I think it is truly both the most dire threat facing us as Jews right now, facing the Jewish community here and around the globe, but also one of the most dire threats facing this country, our security, and our democracy. And so it's so critical that we not let the threat of far-right extremism slip off the radar screen when the news cycle moves on. Hold your officials to account, get involved through organizations like IFA, hold the private sector to account, and just keep ringing the alarm bells on how important this all is.
Amy, that was such an informative and motivating talk. Thank you so much.